headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
You're a former foreign correspondent based in Moscow, so you'll have some insight into the building tension there on the Ukraine border. What's your feeling? Will Putin go in? Well, we're told within hours, maybe days, but we've been being told that now for a month. Do you think we are on the cusp?
Well, this is extremely odd. There's never been any actual evidence produced of an intention by Russia to use its military to invade Ukraine. A Russian invasion of Ukraine would be, on Russian terms, an act of clinical insanity. What would they gain? As my old friend, another former Moscow correspondent, Mary Dejevsky, has written for Spiked Online, the last thing Russia needs is any more territory. It's got so much territory, it doesn't know what to do with it already. An invasion of Ukraine would breach international law, bring down upon Russia the most tremendous sanctions, force it to hold down a very large country full of people who would hate a Russian occupation and resist it. I can see no gain at all. I'm not saying there will be no Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm simply saying if there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine, it will prove that Vladimir Putin is stark staring mad. And if he invades Ukraine, then we will know that he is mad. But if he's not mad, then he won't. I think this is the most extraordinary behaviour by supposedly responsible major powers, shouting and shouting and shouting that there is going to be an invasion. And it's very interesting how the people, and indeed the president of Ukraine, are reacting to it with a certain amount of puzzlement. What is this that's going on? It's really one of the strangest episodes in international affairs that I've ever witnessed. Who is trying to achieve what? We all knew that there was a danger, for instance, that the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were going to invade Czechoslovakia after the breakdown of talks between Brezhnev and Dubček that took place. But that was a wholly different era. Czechoslovakia was part of the Warsaw Pact, and indeed the interesting thing about that era was that Western countries happily stood by and did absolutely nothing when the Soviet Union invaded countries which it believed to be in its sphere of influence. I just don't get it. I don't know why so many people in politics and the media are being so credulous about this alleged threat. There may be such a threat, but whenever I ask anybody to tell me where exactly are these Russian troops, how close to the border are they, what are their actual deployments, no one ever answers the question. It's just taken as read that because somebody in Washington says there's going to be an invasion, there's going to be one. Okay, well then we have to take that seriously because the government of the United States is supposedly a serious body. But what is the purpose of this? What good would it do Russia to stage such an invasion? And why are we making such a big deal out of it when we're also simultaneously saying if they do invade, we won't do anything about it?
And as you say, the people of Ukraine, particularly the president, are extremely frustrated that the West and the NATO nations seem to be whipping up the tension. As I say, I'm not trying to knock down the idea that they might invade soon, but I'm getting rather tired of every morning waking up to be told the invasion is imminent. This has now been going on for at least a month, and the Ukraine people say that actually the threat of Russian invasion allegedly is always around, and they don't feel the tension that evidently we seem to be feeling in London and Washington.
Well, people seem to think it's still the 1930s. The main diplomatic outcome of the Second World War was that the aggressive war was outlawed. It simply is against international law to launch aggressive war, which is why when people want to mess around with neighbouring countries, what they do is they set up people power demonstrations in their capitals, or they send covert troops across the border. Or they destabilize them with strange secret operations, such as the famous Timber Sycamore operation by the CIA in Syria. They don't go in uninvited by the government and invade. It's just the only country which does that now is the United States, which most recently did in Iraq to disastrous effect. So it would be unlikely anyway. Russia can do all kinds of things to Ukraine without invading it, and has done so. So what would be the point? But the effect on Ukraine is interesting. I have said from the start of this that Ukraine itself is being used as a battering ram by other people. It benefits in no way at all from this, just as it didn't benefit from the way in which it was. Who's to say but it was rather strange that when the government of Ukraine was resisting an attempt to bring it into the Western camp by signing an association agreement with the European Union, which had military and political clauses. When the government of Ukraine was resisting doing so, that government was overthrown by a mob which in the previous few weeks had been openly backed by Western politicians who'd gone to give it comfort and support. The whole business seems to me to be one which people look at down the wrong end of the telescope. And this is partly because, my great good fortune, I've lived in Russia. Indeed, I lived in the Soviet Union before it became Russia. I lived in Moscow. I've seen the world from that end. I've traveled in Ukraine. I know more or less where it is, unlike the foreign secretary. And I can tell the Black Sea from the Baltic Sea, unlike the foreign secretary. I sense that, in fact, Liz Truss's rather pitiful ignorance of the whole affair displayed in Moscow last week is completely typical of most of the media and political people now shouting about a new Munich or Russia being about to invade. They just don't understand what's going on or what any of it's about or know the history of it. And it's very much like the atmosphere before the Iraq invasion, where in the media and in diplomacy, all the people who knew about Iraq and understood it were sidelined because they were saying the invasion was a stupid mistake. Of course, they turned out to be right. And again, everybody who knows anything about Russia, either in the media or in diplomacy or politics, is being pushed to one side and pretty much called some kind of traitor for not supporting this extraordinary flamming up of the prospects of war. I'm not going to be trapped into saying there will be no Russian invasion of Ukraine. I will say this, and I'll say it again. If there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine, it will be proof that Vladimir Putin is stark raving mad, because there's no purpose in him doing so. What are we playing this game for? What is the aim of those who are trying to create an enormous crisis in a part of the world which, if anybody knew any history, they would know was one of the most dangerous and volatile there is? And the poor people of Ukraine, a country which properly governed could be fantastically prosperous and successful and stable and happy. What do they get out of this?
Yeah, exactly. Now, in your excellent column yesterday, you pointed out that the NATO of today isn't necessarily the same as the NATO of yesterday, as it were. And in fact, we've just done an item on crazy sort of modern-sounding jobs, as like diversity matron in the NHS. You pointed out that at NATO now they've recently been advertising for an Office of the Gender Advisor, whatever that is.
Oh, yeah, well, but this is the thing. During the Cold War, again, there was a great campaign in this country to prevent us from allowing the installation of American cruise missiles, which was a vital part of NATO's work at the time to counterbalance the Soviet deployment of SS-20 medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe, which completely changed the balance of power. Now, all the people, including actually Liz Truss, she was a child at the time, and her parents, who were not children, but the most fashionable people at that time, were against the installation of cruise missiles and were very anti-NATO and were going around with anti-cruise stickers on their cars. I actually went to NATO. I wrote to their headquarters in Brussels and said, can I have a NATO sticker to put on my car? Would have been in the late 1980s. And I must have been the only person in Oxford with such a thing. And I got a lot of funny looks. And now I find that all the same people who are completely wrong about that, and who didn't take the Cold War seriously, and who didn't think the Soviet Union was a threat, are now convinced that NATO is a force to be supported, and that Russia is a threat when, frankly, it doesn't seem to me to be so. I'm consistent in this. I'm very much in favour of national defence. What's changed around me is that those who control and indeed take part in and command our military forces are now politically correct people of the political left. And that Russia, oddly enough, is probably one of the most conservative countries in Europe. It's all backwards, and yet people are still using the language. If you say anything about Russia that's at all, I won't say sympathetic, but even saying Russia actually has interests which it might want to defend, people call you comrade as if you were a communist. They still don't understand that Russia stopped being communist 30 years ago, and indeed communism is very unpopular there. Because they've experienced it, and also that the Soviet Union stopped existing. This vast, aggressive ideological empire, which menaced and hung over the whole of Eastern Europe, is gone. and yet they still treat Russia as if it was the Soviet Union. It's like treating Austria as if it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's just nonsensical. Nobody knows anything, Kevin. They don't, and the less they know, the louder they shout.
What do you think Putin is playing at then? I mean, we do hear that he believes that the greatest tragedy the world has ever seen is the breakup of the Soviet Union. So potentially his alleged Ukraine ambitions are something to do with beginning to rebuild what was the Soviet edifice, as it were. But in terms of what we're discussing generally, will he invade, won't he invade, perhaps the West's overreaction to the building tension, what is he playing at? What is Vladimir Putin up to, amassing all those troops on the border? What's his game?
Well, first of all, are they on the border? Do you actually know where they are? Have you ever anywhere seen an accurate description of the position of those troops and where they are and what their deployment and what the nature of that deployment is? Secondly, Putin, that quotation about the Soviet Union is actually quite similar to the feelings of many British people after the British Empire collapsed and was replaced by the American, Soviet and Chinese empires, that they felt that the British Empire had been a force for good, and that they were sorry it had gone. Now, you may or may not agree or disagree with that statement, and I'm not going to get into that now. I wouldn't make it myself, partly because it's pointless. But what Putin was saying was issuing a statement of regret about something that had happened. But what Russians understand perfectly well is that they were living on the basis of a huge Stalinist conquest of Europe, on top of the Russian imperial conquest of Central Asia, which had taken place in the 19th century. They no longer have the wealth or the power to maintain that, and they're realists. They understand there is no more realist country in the world than Russia, because it gets invaded so much and has so many enemies. The idea that they're suddenly going to create a gigantic army and roll westwards all over the countries which used to be in the Warsaw Pact or the Baltic states or Ukraine is far-fetched, because they can't afford it. And Russia has, as I constantly point out, roughly the same GDP as Italy. And Italy is in no state to conquer Europe, and nor is Russia. I think it's most unlikely. What they would like to do is re-establish a fair amount of influence over their neighbouring countries, and to keep NATO out of their immediate neighbourhood. Because answer me this if you can, because I've never been given an answer by anybody. What is NATO an alliance against?
Well, it used to be an alliance against what you might call the communist bloc. Now it's a moot point. I don't know quite exactly what its function is and what it's...
Nobody can say. And in fact, when the Soviet Union, which it was an alliance against, collapsed, and when the Warsaw Pact, its opposite, its mirror image in the East, was disbanded, there were quite a lot of people who said, "Well, why do we need this alliance? Why do we? It's like having an alliance against the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarians. They've gone. You don't need it." But what happened, and this is extraordinary, absolutely true, because the New York Times it researched it. There's a huge campaign in the United States, largely financed. This is so crude. I'm embarrassed to say it. Largely financed by weapons manufacturers to persuade the Senate to vote for NATO expansion in the 1990s, and that's really what happened, against the advice of all kinds of people, particularly George Kennan, who you probably know, one of the greatest American diplomats who ever lived, the man who actually formulated Americans' anti-Soviet strategy in the 1940s and 1950s of containment. He came out of retirement to say, please don't expand NATO. All you will do by doing so is undermine the Democrats and the liberals in Russia who are trying to build a new society and create enmity where there wasn't any. And one of the other people who took this view, by the way, was the famous Russian liberal politician Yegor Gaidar, who actually called up the Canadian ambassador in Moscow and said, please, will you beat some sense into the heads of your fellow NATO countries? This expansion of NATO is disastrous. And this, as I say, is the kind of Russian liberal we're supposed to be in favor of. And we ignored his warnings completely. This isn't the expansion of NATO has never been intelligently justified or explained. There was no military or political reason for it. And of course, many of the countries which then became members of NATO were actually very poor countries. not able to defend themselves, and they're reliant completely on other members of NATO, if anything goes wrong, to defend them. Now, is this actually a destabilizing force in Europe? I rather suspect it might be, but it certainly seems to be leading to some destabilization at the moment. But again, why doesn't anybody think about this or debate this? Why can you not think about it or debate it without being accused of unpatriotism or disloyalty, or being a Putin apologist? There is very little proper discussion, and there's a huge amount of non-knowledge about it.
Good talk. Hot talk.
Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.